In the early hours of May 12, 1943, a cluster of small warships pitched through the North Atlantic swells, roughly 400 miles southeast of Cape Farewell, Greenland. The sea was a gray expanse beneath low cloud. Wind tore salt spray across the open bridges of Allied corvettes escorting convoy ONS-5. Ice had formed along the railings during the night watch, thick as a man's thumb, and when lookouts shifted position, their gloves stuck to the metal. The temperature hovered just above freezing. Men stood in duffel coats, stiffened by salt and cold, their hands numb on binoculars, their eyes burning from sleeplessness and wind, scanning a horizon that offered nothing but the rhythmic rise and fall of merchant hulls, each vessel laden with grain, timber, and steel bound for Britain. The corvettes themselves, British ships like HMS Snowflake and Sunflower, Canadian vessels, including HMCS Chambly and Kitchener, were small, ungainly craft displacing barely 1,000 tons, designed originally for coastal patrol and pressed into mid-ocean service by necessity. Their hulls rolled violently in any sea state. Their top speed was 16 knots in calm water, less in weather like this. And in the spring of 1943, German submariners called them the little ships, with open contempt. That contempt was not unfounded. Throughout 1942 and into early 1943, Allied merchant shipping losses in the North Atlantic had reached catastrophic levels. German U-boats, operating in coordinated patrol lines known as Rudeltaktik Wolfpacks, had sunk more than 6 million tons of shipping in 1942 alone. Admiral Karl Donitz, commanding the U-boat arm from his headquarters in Paris, believed the war could be won by severing Britain's supply lines. He needed to sink ships faster than Allied shipyards could replace them, and for most of 1942, he was succeeding. The Canadian corvettes, many crewed by reservists with minimal training, were widely regarded by German commanders as inadequate opposition. British naval historian Mark Milner later wrote that German war diaries from this period frequently dismissed the corvettes as slow, poorly equipped, and operationally ineffective. Some U-boat captains reported attacking convoys within visual range of escorts, confident that the small ships lacked the speed or weaponry to pose a serious threat. On the bridge of HMS Duncan, Commander Peter Gretton stood at the chart table in the cramped wheelhouse, a pencil in one gloved hand, plotting the convoy's position. The overhead lamp swung with the ship's motion, casting shadows across the North Atlantic chart. He had been awake for 36 hours. His eyes ached. Britain's survival depended on convoys like this one. Dozens of merchant formations crossing the ocean each month carrying fuel, food, weapons, and raw materials. If those convoys could not get through, Britain would starve. The mid-ocean gap, the stretch of water beyond the range of land-based aircraft, was the most dangerous zone. Here, U-boats could attack with relative impunity, surfacing at night to use their superior surface speed to position themselves ahead of a convoy, then submerging before dawn. Gretton had been escorting convoys since 1940, and he had watched too many good ships go down in flames. He made another pencil mark on the chart. The convoy was 11 days out from Liverpool. They were not yet halfway across. The Royal Canadian Navy had expanded rapidly during the war, building corvettes in shipyards along the St. Lawrence and manning them with fishermen, farmers, and clerks who had never been to sea before enlistment. By 1943, the RCN was escorting nearly half of all North Atlantic convoys, but its ships were poorly equipped compared to British destroyers. Many Canadian corvettes lacked modern radar. Their sonar sets, known as Anti-Submarine Detection Investigation Committee, were effective only at short range and often confused by temperature layers in the water. Depth charges were crude weapons, dropped in patterns and detonated at preset depths, requiring an escort to pass directly over a submerged submarine, a difficult feat against a maneuvering target. In March 1943, the Wolfpacks achieved their greatest success. German submarines sank more than 100 Allied ships, totaling over 500,000 tons. The Admiralty in London considered the possibility that convoy escort might no longer be viable. Post-war accounts by British planners indicate that some officials privately questioned whether the Atlantic could be held. Donitz, sensing victory, ordered more U-boats into the mid-Atlantic, concentrating them along the convoy routes. By late April, More than 40 submarines were operating south of Greenland, lying in wait for the slow convoys designated ONS Outbound North Slow, which carried ballast and returning merchantmen from Britain toward North America. Convoy ONS-5 departed Liverpool on April 21, 1943, with 43 merchant ships and a close escort of 2 destroyers and 7 corvettes. The escort group, designated B-7, was commanded by Gretton aboard Duncan. His ships were undermanned and overworked, but they had developed a working cohesion over months at sea. What they lacked in equipment, they compensated for with persistence. Gretton had studied U-boat tactics carefully. He knew that submarines preferred to attack at night from the surface, using their diesel engines to outrun escorts. He also knew that the key to defense was detection, finding the U-boats before they could position themselves. For the first 10 days of the crossing, ONS-5 was battered by gales. Waves broke over the bows of the corvettes, flooding the mess decks. Men worked in water up to their knees, bracing themselves against bulkheads as the ships rolled 30 degrees to port, then 30 degrees to starboard. The convoy scattered repeatedly, ships losing contact in the darkness, and the escorts spent much of their time rounding up stragglers. On May 4, U-boats made contact. Over the next 5 days, the submarines shadowed the convoy, calling in reinforcements. By May 5, more than 30 U-boats were converging on ONS-5. Gretton knew they were there. He could feel it. On the night of May 5 and 6, the attacks began. The first torpedo struck a freighter on the convoy's port flank just after midnight. There was a dull thump, felt through the hull of every nearby ship, and then a column of orange flame rose against the darkness. Men on the corvette bridges turned to watch. The freighter listed. Within 2 hours, 7 merchant ships had been hit. Torpedoes struck in rapid succession, silent, lethal, impossible to anticipate. The escorts responded with depth charges, but in the darkness and confusion, it was difficult to hold contact. Anti-Submarine Detection Investigation Committee operators listened through headphones for the faint metallic ping of an echo. Sometimes they heard it. Often they did not. Gretton's destroyer was forced to return to Newfoundland due to fuel shortage, leaving the corvettes to carry the defense. The odds seemed overwhelming. On the bridge of HMCS Chambly, Lieutenant Commander Harold Chesterman stood with a stopwatch in one hand and a radio handset in the other, coordinating the remaining escorts. He could see the fires on the horizon. He could hear the distress calls crackling through the static. He had not slept in 2 days. His hands were stiff with cold. He knew that if the convoy broke apart, the slaughter would be total. He pressed the transmit button. His voice was calm. He gave bearings. He repositioned the screen. He waited. What changed in the early hours of May 6 was not a single dramatic event, but a series of small, disciplined responses that accumulated over hours. The corvettes, despite their limitations, began to work together with greater precision. Chesterman positioned them in a loose screen around the convoy, using short-range radio to direct their movements. When a U-boat was detected on the surface, multiple corvettes converged, forcing it to dive and lose contact. The escorts had learned that even a clumsy depth-charge attack could disrupt a submarine's firing solution, buying time for the convoy to maneuver. More importantly, reinforcements arrived. On May 6, the destroyer HMS Oribai and several additional corvettes joined the escort, bringing with them newer radar sets. British ships now equipped with Type 271 radar, capable of detecting surfaced U-boats at ranges of several miles. That night, as the U-boats pressed their attacks, the escorts began to turn the tables. On the radar screen of HMS Snowflake, the operator saw a contact appear at 4,000 yards, a sharp echo moving across the convoy's stern. He stared at it for 3 seconds, making sure it was real. He called the bearing to the bridge. The corvette came hard to starboard. Engines accelerated. The deck vibrated beneath the crew's feet. Within minutes, they had visual contact, a dark shape on the surface, low in the water, moving fast. The corvette opened fire with its forward gun. The first round was short. The second struck the conning tower. Tracer rounds arced across the darkness. The U-boat crash-dived, leaving a swirl of white water. Snowflake was already overhead, her crew rolling depth charges off the stern rails. 10 charges set to detonate at 150 feet. The charges fell. 8 seconds. 10. 12. The sea erupted in white columns, lifting the corvette's stern, throwing men against bulkheads. Oil surfaced moments later, spreading in a dark slick that gleamed in the searchlight beam. The U-boat did not reappear. Between the nights of May 5 and May 6, 5 U-boats were sunk in the vicinity of ONS-5. U-125, U-531, U-630, U-192, and U-638 were destroyed by depth charges, ramming, or forced to the surface and scuttled by their crews. German war diaries later recovered from Dönitz's headquarters recorded growing alarm. Commanders reported unexpectedly aggressive escort responses, effective radar detection, and mounting losses. On May 6, Dönitz ordered the wolf packs to withdraw. His signal read, in part, that losses had become unbearable and that the convoy was too strongly defended. This was an extraordinary admission. For the first time in the Battle of the Atlantic, a concentrated U-boat attack had been decisively repelled by convoy escorts. Convoy ONS-5 lost 12 merchant ships out of 43, a significant loss, but not catastrophic. Chesterman stood on the bridge of Chambly as dawn broke on May 7, watching the surviving merchantmen reform into columns. The sea was still gray. The wind had not diminished, but the attacks had stopped. More importantly, the destruction of 5 U-boats in a single engagement represented an unsustainable loss rate for the Germans. Historian Mark Milner later argued that the battle around ONS-5 marked the tactical turning point of the Atlantic campaign. The Royal Canadian Navy's official history notes that May 1943 saw 41 U-boats sunk across the Atlantic, the highest monthly total of the war to that point. Dönitz was forced to withdraw his submarines from the North Atlantic convoy routes. Allied shipping losses dropped precipitously. In June 1943, only 17 Allied ships were sunk in the Atlantic, compared to 96 in March. The reasons for this reversal were multiple. The arrival of escort carriers provided air cover in the mid-ocean gap. Improved radar and high-frequency direction finding HFDF, known as Huff Duff, allowed escorts to locate U-boats, transmitting position reports. But the contribution of the Canadian and British corvettes, often overlooked in popular accounts, was essential. These small ships, crewed by men who had been derided as amateurs, had learned to operate as a coordinated force. They had absorbed losses, refined their tactics, and developed a competence that transformed them from easy targets into effective hunters. On the bridge of Chambly, Chesterman kept a logbook in which he recorded every U-boat contact, every depth charge pattern, every lesson learned. The pages were stained with salt, water, and coffee. Those notes, shared among escort commanders at briefings in St. John's and Londonderry, became the foundation of a new tactical doctrine. After the war, several German U-boat commanders were interviewed by Allied naval historians. These accounts, compiled in interrogation reports now held at the National Archives in Kew, reveal a grudging respect for the escorts. One former captain remarked that by mid-1943, the small ships had learned to cooperate effectively, and it became very difficult to approach a convoy undetected. Another noted that the introduction of radar on corvettes changed everything, making surface attacks nearly impossible. Dönitz himself wrote in his post-war memoir that the loss of so many experienced crews in May 1943 could not be replaced, and that the Battle of the Atlantic was effectively lost from that point forward. The men who crewed these vessels returned to Canada and Britain after the war, most resuming civilian lives without fanfare. Commander Gretton was awarded the Distinguished Service Order for his leadership of B-7 Group. Lieutenant Commander Chesterman remained in the Navy for several more years before retiring. Many of the corvette crews never spoke publicly about their service. The Battle of the Atlantic left few visible monuments or dramatic turning points. It was a war of patience, endurance, and small accumulated advantages, won not in a single climactic engagement but across hundreds of convoys and thousands of miles of cold ocean. The German submariners who laughed at the corvettes in 1942 were not fools. Their assessment was reasonable given the equipment and training of the escorts at that time. But they underestimated the capacity of an organization to learn under pressure, and they failed to anticipate that determination and discipline could, over time, compensate for material disadvantage. By the time they realized their mistake, the convoy sinkings had stopped. In the logbooks of the corvettes, the entries from May 1943 are brief and matter-of-fact. Contacts made, depth charges dropped, escorts rejoining station. There are no declarations of victory. But on the radar screens that had flickered uncertainly through the winter, the green sweep now turned in silence, watching over convoys that crossed the Atlantic unmolested, and in that steady rotation patient, tireless, unceasing the war moved slowly and inevitably toward its conclusion.